Hello everyone, long time no speak. At the end of the most recent video on the main channel, at the time of recording this, I mentioned that I was just taking a bit of time to study one of my many weird and difficult to decipher health conditions. This particular one was an instance of subjective dyspnea, which is shortness of breath, which actually made a first appearance about 5 or 6 years ago and has now more recently returned in full force. So I put a pause on work and I decided to use all my attention and knowledge and skills and everything I'd picked up from studying medical conditions in more recent years to this old problem that I never really had an answer for. I mean, when it first appeared, it seemed like a reaction to milk protein, and that was a repeatable test. And given that it's a completely subjective and sensory issue and non-objective, there's no evidence of anything going wrong, and it's not anxiety, then they kind of got narrowed down to an immune/nerve response. When studying it this time, I made a whole bunch of new discoveries, which at first confused me because when you take a data-driven and more scientific approach to figuring things out, since you don't have the answer, the data looks confusing, and there'll be things that you kind of didn't necessarily want to be true that are looking like they are true. So for example, all of a sudden, it looked like I had become reactive to like every single food group. So instead of just milk protein making me breathless, it was like red meat and vegetables and fruit and sugar and like everything. Fast forward, so I don't bore you with everything, it seems the most appropriate commonality between all of them, or the one that fits the data the most, is histamine. A lot of people have a histamine intolerance, but mine seems to have a slightly different manifestation, which I think is modified by my blood conditions. So I've got Gilbert syndrome, which is a relatively common condition. I think it's like 10 to 15. I think depending on where you look, it will have different ranges. But a side result of having Gilbert syndrome is that your bilirubin count in your blood is high generally as a baseline, because your liver is less capable of filtering out bilirubin or slower at making it water soluble. And I want to be careful not to try and go too into specifics, because I want to be careful about giving misinformation. So I need to say that everything I found here is only from my own data and seems to apply to me. But if you take anything away from this video, make sure that you check with a medical professional before making any changes to your lifestyle based on what you hear on a single video, right? So your body's less capable of filtering out bilirubin with Gilbert syndrome. Now, interestingly, again, don't just take my word for it, do your own research. When your body is overloaded with histamine, or if the amount of histamine that you're intaking and your mast cells, your immune cells, are releasing overpowers your body's natural threshold for dealing with it. So you've got like an enzyme in your gut, let me get the right name for it, diamine oxidase. So that's the one in your gut, and there's another one for your body filtering out histamine in the blood, I believe. Let me get this. There you go. The secondary pathway is histamine and methyltransferase. Now you only have a certain amount of each. And the theory behind histamine intolerance goes that if you overpower that amount, then your body has an excess in histamine, which gets stored in tissues and starts reacting more with your body because a variety of cells have histamine receptors on them, so it will start interfering. But interestingly, if you overwhelm your histamine clearance, then histamine and bilirubin compete to be cleared by the liver, which means that they're now directly affecting each other. So if you have a diet high in histamine, and if your body is releasing a lot of histamine in response to like allergens, then your toxin clearance will also go down. And one thing we noticed in a blood test recently is that my bilirubin count in my blood spiked way higher than it ever has. It's about 60 U-mol, whereas my baseline is usually around 30 to 40. So I was doing a data analysis here at home. I was ranking the severity of my dyspnea throughout the day, every day, and then I was making a note of when I would ingest certain foods or medication. Then I would take a fingerprint every time I ingested something, and what I mean by that is I would calculate all of the severity for the next 24 and 48 hours after each instance, and then calculate an average for each of those, and then do that every single time it was ingested. And to avoid cross-contamination with different ingredients, I mixed up my diet to randomize it a bit. So over time, what it means is that if you abstract averages from the total 24 and 48 hour impacts after having certain ingredients, then you can get a graph that shows you roughly which foods are more suspicious or less suspicious. So I ended up with a graph showing me which foods were actually contributing more to the breathless sensation. And that's where I found out that they were all the high histamine foods. Red meat, spinach specifically, bananas. Also for me, sources of milk protein, so certain types of like milk chocolate, and also interestingly, certain sources of probiotics. Not every source, but it does also seem to be a thing that certain strains of lactobacillus, or bacillus, however they say it, kind of interfere with the histamine production process. These are different types of gut bacteria bacteria that produce different byproducts. So the combination of these things, my data showing me histamine flagging up as suspicious and the blood showing bilirubin spiking, kind of put this theory together that, okay, they might be interacting with each other. I don't know how common this is. I don't actually know if this has been recorded. Histamine intolerance has been recorded, but it seems like the kind of thing that might not actually be studied much. But histamine overpowering or overtaking the liver's ability to filter bilirubin, I don't know much about that. That might be like a contentious thing, but that's what my data seems to suggest. So I think I have hypersensitive mast cell degranulation episodes. What I mean by that is the mast cells in your body, these immune cells that detect allergens, they are packed full of histamine and other compounds, and then in response to certain allergens they release it. And I believe, now looking back, that's where my milk protein reaction comes from. I think when they detect milk protein they degranulate, and then I get a histamine spike. But like I said, for me, breathlessness is completely not objective, so it's purely sensory. And I was trying to look at ways that might be possible in this theory, and there are a couple of options. So one is that histamine directly interfaces with like vagus nerve cell endings. Apparently, again, you might need to check this all up because I'm not an expert, and that by binding to the receptors it can increase the uptake of sodium and calcium in the nerve endings, which makes them more conductive, which means they're more likely to fire, which means that if they're firing like all the time, then the signal process that tells you like you've got a full breath is messed up, and then the brain isn't really compatible with this new signaling pattern, so it feels like breathlessness. There's also apparently a neuroinflammation possibility where mast cells can also release pro-inflammatory markers where the nerve endings themselves will become inflamed, and then that will cause like some false triggering as well. Something else I noticed was interesting was that during episodes like this, whenever I have anything irritating like minty or menthol-like, that also directly and quickly causes the sensation to spike. So you go from being able to catch a breath to having something minty just in your mouth, even if it's like toothpaste, and then you've just lost the ability to feel full breaths again. Now, it's not a bronchospasm, it's not acid related. I've taken meds to get rid of that. I've been doing lung function tests all the time. It's not, it's purely sensory. And remember, this isn't the first time I've been investigated for it. I've had an endoscopy, that was the first time. I've had a couple of chest x-rays, ultrasound, even had an MRI during the balance issue, which didn't flag up anything. But there is also a possibility, putting this theory together, the receptors in the mouth, specifically for menthol, let me see if I can get the receptor ID. There we go, TRPM8 receptors, could be messing with signals being passed by the vagus nerve. So if you imagine the vagus nerve is in this kind of hyperstimulated and hyperconductive state, and then you have menthol, it contributes to this unusual signal profile for the brain. So I'm still trying to figure it out, but applying this theory is the only thing that actually matches all of my data and also makes it predictable, meaning that I can predict when my symptoms will get better or worse when considering histamine and nerve hypersensitivity. What tends to happen is that after 3 days of my last exposure to a high histamine food, I will then see improvements to the average in 3-hour blocks of the day. There'd be subtle improvements. So it doesn't get rid of it entirely, but if you look at the pattern and then you see non-exposure days at the delay of about 3 days, then you can get a predictable improvement. So as a result of that, I moved on to a low exposure diet. But the interesting thing now is to try and learn more about the hypersensitivity of like mast cell degranulation and release. The other interesting question is also about inflammation, because a histamine intolerance will manifest in different ways for different people. A lot of people get sick, a lot of people get like diarrhea and stuff like that, and some people do get breathless, but for me it seems the one and only reaction is the sensory inhibition. Now again, that's another question because I don't know if that's been recorded before either. But inflammation is an interesting thing because, like, as far as I understand, people with immune deficiencies, which I do have, just lymphocytopenia in general, as well as thrombocytopenia, they technically wrote me down as ITP, being immune thrombocytopenia when I was younger. As far as I understand it, inflammation can be a bit of like a weird subject because a lot of people get fevers, right, when they get infections, but some people don't get fevers, and I'm one of those people that just doesn't ever get one. Inflammation for injuries is also interesting because when I had a kind of dry socket recently, it's a non-constant inflammation, even though the injury's there. I'm unaware if it's supposed to be constant or not, but it would do this sine wave fluctuation throughout the day where it'd be really intense and then like quite literally over the course of a few minutes, it would just disappear, like no pain whatsoever, low inflammation, and then a little while later it would just intensify and swell up again. Similar patterns for when I had the nerve damage for the eye recently. There'd be this intensifying of symptoms and then a sine wave decrease in symptoms, and then it would go up and down and fluctuate for about like 6 months. And again, there's this similar thing with the breathing pattern. So So there's this intensifying and then this decrease, and it goes up and down and up and down. And if you look at like a heat map of the severity, it's an interesting wave. I've come to learn that my body manifests nerve-related sensations as sine waves, which is another reason why I'm pretty confident of this dyspnea being a subjective and nerve-based issue. So I do believe that increased conductance of like vagus nerve endings and neuroinflammation are the actual causes of the sensation, just as a side effect of this histamine intolerance, which is otherwise not manifesting any regular, easily identifiable symptoms. So like I said, I've got a diet now which is low in histamine, and I'm taking certain supplements, being B6, again, just to try and make sure the diamine enzyme is kind of being healthily produced for the gut to get rid of histamine, so that we're not overloading the body with excess histamine that gets just stored up in tissues. And also occasionally taking quercetin to try and stabilize mast cells so they're not just degranulating and pumping out more histamine into the body that would be interrupting the liver filtration process. There has been one more confusing thing. So like I said, the pattern is predictable. Applying the histamine theory, I see improvements, which is wonderful, but it seems tenuous because an unexpected trigger behavior has been happening. At the beginning of this episode, when I would drink a can of Pepsi Max, it would not affect the symptoms at all. About halfway through this episode, if I had a can of Pepsi Max on a day, then it would give me like a reaction increase for a few hours, which was weird because that never really happened. In a phase of improvement, a couple of days ago, I had a can of Pepsi Max again, but this time it had a huge reaction that lasted all the rest of the day into the following day and will probably carry on today. So that was confusing because that's not pumping histamine in, or at least not much, but it seems that the amount that it's interfering with the symptoms has increased as the episode has progressed over the course of the month. Now, one possible reason for that, and this isn't supposed to happen because I tried researching it, is that the actual drink, Pepsi, is triggering a mast cell degranulation phase where you drink it, the body reacts, and it releases all this histamine that is built up. Again, that shouldn't happen, but again, trying to research it, it's apparently possible that the mast cells themselves adapt and learn to be more sensitive or release more easily in such episodes as this. And that might have happened back in 2020, which is probably why I saw a gradual improvement in my reaction to milk protein anyway after about half a year, which is roughly how long it takes for like a full mast cell replacement cycle, I believe, something around there. Like they can die and be replaced themselves if they over-release, I think. But from what I've learned over time, they tend to replace themselves anyway, and that can functionally act as like a resetting of the baseline for sensitivity. This might be the case now that the reason why a single can of Pepsi triggered such a strong reaction might ironically be because there's an improvement. What I mean is, imagine like the mast cells being a battery for histamine, where if they're releasing all the time, such as maybe the beginning of this episode, then they're depleted all the time. So if you have something that would release it, there's nothing to release, so you don't see a reaction. Halfway through, you're getting a bit more better at holding onto the stores and your mast cells aren't releasing all the time. So they're kind of building up a little bit like a battery. So then when you take something that triggers them, they have more to release. So that gives you a short reaction. And then now on a low histamine diet and mast cell stabilizers, it's bulking up really strongly like a battery because the histamine is actually being kept where it should be in your body. And then you take something that triggers it and then there's more to release. So it causes a far stronger reaction. That's one possible reason. Again, none of this is backed up by any research that I found, but out of all the theories that I've experimented with, including things like high free iron in the blood causing oxidative stress, increasing the speed of red blood cells dying and being reproduced, increasing the bilirubin in the blood and removing nitric oxide from the blood, which is causing the dyspnea. That doesn't match up. Those things are far too systemic and generalized. This theory matches the data. It becomes predictable. I can actually see green and red on my screen in response to a heat map of histamine exposure. So it's far more convincing. So like I said, I'm not an expert, but I figured I would just A, give people an update on where I've been for the month, and B, just share some of the things I've found. Because it'd be interesting to know or hear from other people that know they have histamine intolerances. Maybe also from people that have had unexplained reactions to high histamine foods, like aged cheeses or alcohol like wine, or certain types of fruits like bananas or vegetables like spinach. The really interesting thing is that it's not food group specific. So like spinach is high in histamine, but kale is not. Now on the surface, for people that don't know about histamine in diet, these two things might look functionally the same, which is why it's confusing when every single food group flags up as suspicious on a chart. It's not really anything to do with the food group. It's just the fact that coincidentally, everything chosen for the diet happened to be high in histamine, and that if you literally just shift the food slightly, so instead of bananas, like blueberries instead of steak, like beef, go for chicken, instead of spinach, go for kale. Like if you just shift things slightly, then that causes a massive difference. So that's where I've been. I guess we'll leave it there. I'm trying to get back into work now. It's just, I feel much more comfortable having what I would consider to be a whole rounded theory to work with and a plan now moving forward. I'm pretty confident about my recovery. Like I said, it's given me the power of prediction now. So I feel more comfortable about jumping back into work. So otherwise, I hope you're all doing well. If you made it to the end, leave a medical related emoji in the comments so I can see who you are. Gives us a bit of a nice parasocial connection. But also, I just like to hear from people that lurk. I'm a lurker myself. Like I never comment on anything. Or I do, but it's very rare. So I like to hear from people that are a bit like me. So thanks for watching. Stay safe and I'll see you next time.